Throughout the years in Yu-Gi-Oh, archetypes will often get support years after their initial run of cards. Some, like Blue Eyes and Dark Magician, are so iconic that they seem to receive support almost every year that keeps their playstyle relevant to the format at the time, at least at a casual level. However, there are archetypes that get left behind and left to the passages of time. In the most recent booster pack Eternity Code, there were a number of archetypes that received support for the first time in a while, including the likes of Resonators and Infernoids, with even a one-off piece of support for the Barbaros monsters. And because of these cards, I wanted to talk today about some archetypes that I believe are worthy of getting some new support. Now, as a disclaimer before we start this video is entirely subjective, and mostly archetypes I would like to see get more support in the future, not just the ones that have gone the longest without any new cards. This is based on anything from playstyle or gimmick to their aesthetic, and while I can't say for certain what the new cards will need to do to help improve the archetypes, I would love to see more support for these archetypes for the people who do play them and enjoy the decks themselves. And while these aren't in any particular order, the ones later in the video are the ones I think should get support the most. So drop a like on the video and feel free to subscribe if you haven't already. It's free, it helps the channel, and you can always unsubscribe later on if you feel like it. So let's get things started with the Bachelorman archetype. A deck that started out nearly unplayable, it received new support periodically throughout the first half of the decade, and became more and more relevant as the new cards in the archetype adapted to the card design of the times, eventually developing a pretty decent OTK strategy. The last piece of support they received was Bachelorman Solar, a card that aided in getting other Bachelormen onto the field like Fuel Cell and Industrial Strength by fulfilling their summoning requirements, even though it found a better place in Thunder Dragon decks. This one card is the only support the deck has received since 2014 in Duelist Alliance, and I would like to see the archetype expanded upon into the modern game. Spell Trap support will go a long way to facilitating the setup necessary to bring out the bosses of the deck, and with cards like Short Circuit in their arsenal, I think furthering support for this explosive strategy would be a good way to keep with the goal of the deck, but translate it into the modern age. Second on the list is Chronomaly, an archetype that I'm honestly quite surprised hasn't received more support due to its use in the Zexal anime by Trey, or 3 depending on if you watch Double Sub. With the deck having received no new cards since 2014, it is more than overdue for an update to its roster. While their aesthetic is definitely something to behold, and I love the overall design of the cards, I feel as though having their boss monsters be all different ranks really hampers what the deck is capable of, with monsters ranging from rank 3 to rank 7. It makes building a deck around the monsters difficult without dipping into cards from other archetypes. For the new support, I think providing the deck with ways to manipulate levels will go a long way to improving the output of the deck overall. While cards like Gordian Knot and Golden Jet do exist, both of these monsters cannot easily be used to bring out the monsters of level 3, 6 or 7. So I think some spell and trap support would go a long way to alleviating the holes in the deck strategy, especially considering there are only 4 Chronomaly spells and traps in the game, one of which is this. Yeah. Third up are Toons, an archetype which I'm surprised has stopped receiving support since the middle of 2016, and one that's on this list purely because I love Pegasus as a character, and I love the aesthetic of the cards themselves. Taking existing monsters and toonifying them is a really fun concept, but I feel as though there's a lot of wasted potential in the deck, not to mention there are about 5 different ways their summoning conditions function mechanically, which is not confusing at all. I think it would be interesting to see them adapt Xyz and Link monsters into Toon counterparts, especially considering how many level 4s there are within the archetype, and considering cards like Comic Hand, Toon Dark Magician and Toon Red Eyes exist, it wouldn't be too difficult to get multiple monsters on board for a Link summon. It would allow the deck to make Toon versions of Utopia and Decode Talker, 2 iconic monsters in a similar vein to a lot of the Toon lineup, while actually making them playable. While I'm not certain on what their effects could be, they would obviously have to be based on the original monsters, and doing so could provide Toons with a way of playing that isn't just pray Toon Kingdom stays on board and attack directly every turn. It would certainly make things a bit more interesting. The number 4 slot on this list goes to UA, or Ultra Athletes. The concepts of athletes being jacked as all hell, and the mechanic of returning monsters to the hand to summon themselves is interesting conceptually, but the execution of that has left a lot to be desired, especially considering the last card to be announced came out in 2015, and yet the deck itself still feels incomplete. For starters, the reliance on returning another UA to hand means you need to get one out in the first place, and yet they only have one level 4 or lower monster in the lineup. Providing another normal summonable monster would go a long way to improving the deck as a whole, or even simply just providing ways through the spell trap support to get monsters onto the field as a way of supplementing Signing Deal. It is worth noting, however, that some of the existing support is already extremely strong, such as Powder Jersey. With that being said, the deck struggles to get multiple monsters out, especially the ones they want to have out, such as Dreadnought, Dunker and Perfect Ace, so it would be something to bear in mind when designing future support, but since there hasn't been any since 2015, I think they need it. Speaking of incomplete archetypes, the number 5 slot on this list goes to Triamids, who only appeared in one set, the Dark Illusion, all the way back in 2016. I still don't understand what Konami was going for with this deck. The concept itself is great, using a modular field spell in order to control the field with Sphinx and the smaller monsters. But that's all they do, and they do it poorly at best. I think expanding upon the monster lineup in the deck would go a long way to helping it become playable, giving them effects to either aid in the deck's consistency or perhaps even punish the opponent simply for playing their deck, something like pop when one of the field spells leaves the field. But in all honesty, the main reason why the deck is on this list is that I'd love to see a Link monster based on the pyramid in the field spell artworks. While Links didn't exist when this archetype was released, and Sphinx, to be honest, is a good boss monster, I think getting out a Link monster that interacts with the field spells would be an interesting way to expand the archetype. Something perhaps like its effects changing based on the field spell that's active, as all three show the pyramid in different forms. I don't know, I think it'd be cool to see. 6th on this list is Penguins, whose last piece of support came out in 2013 in the form of a card that simply negates effect damage, and no, Fluffle Penguin does not count. Not only is the artwork mostly adorable, but an archetype of swarming with low stat monsters that bounce cards is a fun mechanic that I really wish was explored further. In all honesty, I'm surprised so few archetypal cards for Penguins exist, as I could have sworn it was bigger than just a handful. But I digress. The first thing I think the archetype would need to become a proper deck is spell and trap support. Some way to either facilitate the bouncing effects of their monsters, or to aid in the small amount of swarming they already have. Either would provide them with more ways to get to their main removal options, which, ironically enough after all this time, remains at the likes of Penguin Soldier. Additionally, I would love to see some extra deck support that would allow them to push the game a little bit easier. Bouncing is a strong form of removal, balanced by the requirement to be flipped in this archetype, so having a Link 1 that facilitates that would go a long way to helping the deck overall. Perhaps even a boss monster which gains attack every time a card is sent back to the hand, just something to make the archetype more of a solid deck. They're adorable, and I wish I could play them. Next up, at number 7, we have Entities of the Outer and Elder variety. What an interesting set of cards this archetype is, with a Lovecraftian aesthetic ranging in quality from bannable to not played at all. The overall goal of the archetype, if there is one, is to summon out Azathoth using Nyala as material. So, with the upcoming changes to Master Rules in mind, how do we go about supporting such an unusual archetype? Well, for starters, I think seeing some main deck monsters would be pretty nice. You could mould them around being worshippers of the gods, and suit their effects to bringing out their extra tech gods. Level modulation to support Xyz and Synchro monsters, swarming to help provide materials for a fusion spell that could banish itself to help call out a Synchro or Xyz, not unlike Ultra Polymerization, and perhaps a Link monster that requires 3 extra deck types as material that could serve to create some interruptions on your opponent's turn depending on their effects. For a series of cards that haven't received any support since 2015, There's a lot of potential with the weirdness of them that Konami just simply hasn't tapped into yet. This is one of those archetypes I wouldn't mind the support being super gimmicky for to support the playstyle, as the entities by themselves are already rather gimmicky. Plus, more cards to suit the aesthetic would always be nice to see in an era of clean card design by Konami. And now we get to the final 3 archetypes, which are all ones that have only had one piece of support in the past decade. None of which were particularly good, although the last one on this list did alright. Starting with number 8 on this list, we have Watts. Watts have the unusual gimmick of being able to attack directly, while also being a synchro archetype and having a gimmick of having most of their effects trigger after attacking. The most recent support, Watt Train, can help with swarming, but relies on having already done some setup, and you still have to wait a turn before you can special summon the monsters out. While they do have a pretty damn good trap in Watt Cancel, it alone isn't enough for the deck. So, what support do I think Watt should get? Well, as with any old decks, consistency and swarming are key, and that is even more relevant here given their nature as a synchro deck. Speaking of, having synchro monsters that are worth going into would go a long way. Perhaps having protection which will allow their effects to go off safely after they attack directly. Now, attacking directly is honestly a hard mechanic to balance, as providing too much swarming or effects triggering from the attacks can mean the deck can simply ignore whatever your opponent puts out and go for game anyway. But the deck needs to get the monsters out in the first place, which is what Watt lacks, along with a proper boss monster that the deck can work towards and give it a goal. So I think having that in any new support it gets would go a long way. Second to last is Flamvell. We've only got one card of support since 2011. Another archetype that has a stupidly strong trap card in the form of Flamvell Counter. What it does in banishing stuff from your opponent's graveyard is poor at best, not to mention completely separate from the archetype's initial design, which focused mainly around attack gain and burn damage. But let's focus on that banishing gimmick, as I would love to see that expanded upon beyond the one card of support they got in Neo Flamvell Lady in 2018. While they do have one of the best support cards ever in Rekindling, this does little to mitigate the fact that the gimmick of banishing cards from your opponent's graveyard is not that good, not by any stretch of the imagination. So what new support should they get? Beyond the classics of consistency and swarming without the need for Rekindling, I think providing cards that can help facilitate the banishing effects turn 1 would help, perhaps by milling the opponent's deck on summon before using other monsters or spell and traps to banish those cards. Some more synchros wouldn't hurt either, especially if they had quick effects that banished either from the field or graveyard in order to interrupt your opponent's plays. But that brings us to the final archetype that deserves more support. And if you've been around the Yugioh subreddit at all recently, then you probably already know what this is. Yes, Pain96, this one's for you, mate. The last archetype that I think should get some more support is, of course, Volcanics. This is a tough one to balance, considering it focuses on burn damage, and it already does that quite well. So instead, if they were to get new support, I would like to see it focus more on the combo you get with the original Blaze Accelerators and Doomfire, where even though they stop you from attacking, your opponent then must attack Doomfire on the next turn if they control monsters in attack mode. And given Link monsters now exist, that effect, and the destruction and burn effect afterward, is arguably more potent than ever. Perhaps giving the deck a way to protect Doomfire in the form of some back row or field spell support would go a long way to help them, or even make a Blaze Accelerator card that can destroy back row or provide negation on each turn by sending a Pyro to the grave. Even a card that can add Volcanics to hand to support these effects of the accelerators could prove useful, or a card that returns them from the grave to hand akin to Firestorm guards that can support both sides of the Volcanic strategy. And those are my picks for archetypes that I believe should really get some more support in future packs. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and let's discuss any archetypes you believe should get some more support in the future, as well as what you think they'll need in order to become a better deck overall. As I said in the previous video, I'm now streaming on Twitch, so come say hi over there if you want to see me mess around and play some games. I won't be uploading that side of the content to YouTube anymore for the sake of the algorithm, so that's where you'll find it from here on out. But at the end of the day, folks, take care of each other, and I shall see you all in the next video.